Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. Few figures in contemporary American history are as controversial or divisive as Henry Kissinger. In this episode of Horns, we listen to a talk given by Professor Tom Schwartz of Vanderbilt University about his book, Henry Kissinger and American Power, A Political Biography. Schwartz argues Kissinger, though he is most associated with international diplomacy and international affairs, is best understood by understanding him as a domestic political figure, whose moves were calculated based on his approval ratings and how he played within the domestic political audience. Schwartz's talk is illustrated with clips from Kissinger's television appearances and makes the case that Kissinger's relationship with Nixon involved rivalry as well as partnership and was carefully calculated on Kissinger's part to present an image that put him in the best and most favorable light to the American public. The conversation is wide-ranging and interesting. It's hosted by Mark Lawrence, professor of history at the University of Texas Austin and also director of the Lyndon Baines Johnson Presidential Library, also at the University of Texas of Austin. Let's listen in.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mark Lawrence. I teach history at the University of Texas and these days serve as director of the LBJ Presidential Library and Museum. Well, it's my huge pleasure to be able this afternoon to introduce one of the really terrific diplomatic and international historians working today, Professor Tom Schwartz of Vanderbilt University. There are a lot of ways to introduce Tom, and I think the most straightforward one is to talk about his truly impressive academic accomplishments. He's held fellowships from the SSRC, the Nobel Institute, the Wilson Center, the Center for the Study of European Integration. He's published really influential and important books, beginning with America's Germany, John J. McCloy and the Federal Republic of Germany, and more recently, a book that brought him many times to Austin and especially to the LBJ Library, Lyndon Johnson and Europe in the Shadow of Vietnam, a book that I personally have learned a tremendous amount from. But Tom's contributions go far beyond these highlights of his impressive CV. He is also an award-winning teacher, a truly dedicated advisor to any number of grad students who've had the good fortune to work with him over the years, many of whom have gone on to very distinguished careers. And he is a builder of community among international and diplomatic historians of all ages and stages in a way I think that really makes him one of the go-to people in the field. And I know personally I have benefited a tremendous amount from Tom's leadership, from his insight, and it's from his friendship over the years. So it's really a treat for me on lots of levels, intellectual, as a representative of the field, but also in a personal way, to welcome Tom to speak about his latest enormous achievement, published in 2020, Henry Kissinger and American Power, A Political Biography. Tom, thanks so much for being with us. I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Mark, for having me here. I'm honored by that introduction. Thrilled to be able to speak to this group for a lot of reasons. Both Mark and Jeremy Suri are two of my closest friends within the profession, and I've benefited enormously from their work, their scholarship, and their friendship. I also do have this attachment to the LBJ Library, having spent many, many hours there with the incredible staff. I've also got an attachment now to the LBJ School of Public Affairs, where my daughter, Marini, has had an absolutely fantastic experience there with great mentors, great teachers, and just a wonderful group of fellow students. So I feel very connected to Austin and I'm really honored to be able to give this talk. My book is Henry Kissinger and American Power, Political Biography. My book's title, I had an alternate title in mind, which is an allusion to one of the most prominent bestsellers of the 1970s, the decade in which Kissinger was so prominent. One of the bestsellers of that time was Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Sex, But Were Afraid to Ask. And Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Henry Kissinger. I'm not sure that I fulfilled that necessarily in the book, but that was kind of my sort of alternate and less serious title for the book. Why another book on Kissinger? Well, in the process of working on this book, many have been written, and they have very different interpretations of Henry Kissinger. There is the heroic statesman that Neil Ferguson, who's very Harvard, now at Stanford, professor who's written a 1-volume, 900-page book on Kissinger's early career. Then there are much more critical books. Greg Grandin's book, Kissinger's Shadow, Robert Brigham's Reckless. Kissinger tends to bring out very diametrically opposed views on his contributions and his significance in American history. So I had to think in terms of justifying it. And even in this last year, 2 more books appeared on Kissinger. The Inevitability of Tragedy by Barry Guin, who's the editor of the New York Times Book Review, and Stephen Rabe's Kissinger in Latin America, which is a very critical account of Kissinger's role in Latin America. My justification for the book, and I think this is essentially the argument I make, is that, in effect, I was asked to try and write a book that used Kissinger's biography to get at larger themes, effectively, is that, in effect, what I was going to try to do is talk about American foreign relations, the history of American foreign relations through Henry Kissinger, using him as a prism to get at the ideas about the history of American foreign relations in the 20th century. This was the original purpose of the particular series that Hill and Wang enticed me to contribute to. My introduction deals with Kissinger in general and some of the themes. I focus in the first chapter. I try to do in about 80 pages what Neil Ferguson did in 900, talk about Kissinger's career before he became National Security Advisor. And then the bulk of the book is about the 8 years in which he played a crucial role in conducting American foreign policy, bringing that through his National Security Advisor, his role in the Nixon administration's attempt to bring about a different type of American foreign policy, a retrenchment in American foreign policy, but also recalibrate it. And then his role as Secretary of State, and then his role under the Ford administration. And then I have a last chapter, which is tentative in some ways, but does talk about Kissinger's career in the 40-plus years since he left power. And that is the goal. And I will talk about that in the context of the book and see if I can bring out some of the points over the course of this talk. I used Kissinger papers that are largely publicly available. Those are mostly his government papers. His personal collection at Yale will become more fully available after his death. But right now, I used most of the materials that are from his government service. I used his 4,000 pages of memoirs, his writings. I also used materials from the Nixon libraries and other assorted collections. Another key source is the 2+ years of the Nixon tapes, which I think get at Kissinger's role in a much more unvarnished way, and I think are important. And finally, I used a source that's not been used, and of course it does. The reason for that is my presence here at Vanderbilt, the Vanderbilt Television News Archive, which began recording the evening news in 1968. And one has to recall and has to remember that in the late 1960s and early 1970s, television news was the primary way most Americans came to understand their world. The evening news was seen as far more objective and straightforward than even newspapers. It reached more people. And so the ability to use that as a source to track how Kissinger came across to the American people was important. And I will make the case, and I think you'll hear it in some of the tapes, that this was also important to Nixon and Kissinger, how their foreign policy came across to the television news. The problem is, and one of the issues with the use of the television news archive, is there are all sorts of copyright and other issues. I would have loved to show you a number of clips from the television news archive, but there are problems of using direct links to that archive because of copyright restrictions placed on the archive by the television networks themselves, who have been very hard to work with in terms of seeing their news as a public product. They contend that it is private and they control the rights and ability to use. And so they actually sued the television news archive back in the 70s, trying to close it down. Effectively, Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee, responding in some ways to Vanderbilt, added a clause in the copyright revision law that gave the Television News Archive the ability to record the news as but with certain restrictions. I've been able to use that product, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it as we go along. I want to start by talking about my argument in the book, and that, in effect, most treatments of Henry Kissinger see him as a foreign policy intellectual, an advocate of what's called realpolitik, the pursuit of a pragmatic and realistic foreign policy that promoted American security and the national interest, an interest here defined fairly narrowly in military and economic terms, largely downplaying moral, ethical considerations like human rights. I think, in effect, this is not a wrong characterization of Kissinger, but it is very incomplete. And I would make the case that what sets my book apart from many of the other treatments of Kissinger is I argue for the centrality of politics in understanding Henry Kissinger. Kissinger as a political actor, that his self-presentation was always as an independent and nonpartisan expert on foreign policy, but that he himself recognized the centrality of politics and how deeply intertwined domestic and foreign policy are within the American system. Kissinger's skill with the media also enhanced his authority as the symbol of Nixon and Ford foreign policy. And that's essentially the type of argument I present in the book, is looking very much at Kissinger through a political lens. Here are a couple of quotations just to indicate that this is not my particular insight necessarily. It also has been said about him. I thought it was interesting that French Foreign Minister Michel Joubert, who was one of Kissinger's strongest rivals for a time in the 70s, said it was said he had the taste for stardom, that he was a foreign policy prima donna, but I believe he was just interested in politics. He's a politician above all else. He calculated like a politician. And then Robert Hartman, who was an aide to Ford, wrote about Kissinger as a dedicated American, unquestionably the ablest diplomat I've seen in my lifetime, and probably as good a politician, international and international, as all but a formidable few. And interestingly, he puts him in a category with Churchill, Roosevelt, Zhou Enlai, de Gaulle, Nehru, Khrushchev, Golda Meir, and Richard Nixon. I think those were fascinating insights when I came across them. And I do think Kissinger as a political figure is an important area to pursue and to follow. I don't spend a lot of time on Kissinger's youth and background. Jeremy has written a fabulous book on Kissinger that talks much more about this. Obviously, one of the most important things to know about Henry Kissinger, though, is that he grew up in Nazi Germany and had to flee. His family and his mother and his two brothers and father fled Nazi Germany in 1938. Kissinger's own sense of the world was in some ways shaped by this experience. I would also argue that culturally, Kissinger has retained very tight and strong connections to German culture and German practices and customs. But at the same time, of course, I think the experience of being an immigrant to the United States obviously shaped his early life. Most importantly, of course, and this is, of course, what makes Kissinger's has said often that had the army in World War II not come along, he might have very well ended up an accountant in New York City. But like many Americans, he was drafted in 1943, and his knowledge of the German language plus his intelligence led him to be brought into Army intelligence. This is a picture of him with his first mentor, Fritz Kramer. Kramer was at the time, or at least also self-identified as a non-Jewish German emigre who opposed Hitler. Turned out Kramer, actually, his great-grandfather was Jewish. But Kramer also helped Kissinger in many ways to get various positions in Army intelligence and advanced his career. Kissinger would have a formidable experience in liberating a concentration camp at Ahlem on April 10th, 1945, about which I think Ferguson writes very movingly in his book. And I think that experience certainly shaped some of Kissinger's views of life, of fate, you might say, of the world itself. And to a certain extent, without being too deterministic, some of his ideas about international affairs was certainly shaped by his recognition of how disastrous countries like Germany could go, and what can be the fate of world powers. Kissinger goes to Harvard. At Harvard, he is a really quite a extraordinary graduate student career. He is involved with the creation of a journal, Confluence. He networks. He is one of the, and Ferguson has highlighted this in one of his most recent works as well, one of the outstanding networkers in the sense of international exchange of ideas. He develops a very strong anti-communist persona, setting up the International Seminar at Harvard, which brought Europeans and then later other figures from around the world to the United States for a seminar in American politics. And Kissinger would often comment that so-and-so who was in the Turkish or Japanese government had been a student of his at the International Seminar. Kissinger also in the 1950s becomes an advisor to Nelson Rockefeller, who was a up-and-coming Republican liberal politician and would become governor of New York and was thought to be clearly a future president of the United States. And Kissinger would become his foreign policy advisor. But most importantly is that Kissinger writes a bestseller from his work at the Council on Foreign Relations. He writes a bestseller, Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy, which will make a case for limited nuclear war. In many respects, the book seems a bit strange now looking back at it, but at the time it was seen as an effective answer to what was seen as the Eisenhower administration's rigid foreign policy of massive retaliation using nuclear weapons. And Kissinger's approach of talking about the idea that there might be limited nuclear war led it to become a bestseller and for Kissinger's fame to come very prominently into focus. So much so that Mike Wallace, if we could go to the next slide, Mike Wallace would have him on his program in 1958. And this would be Kissinger on national television in July of 1958. And I'm going to show you a brief clip from this. C-SPAN has put it up on their website, and we're going to show you a clip of Kissinger talking about his own sensibility as a nonpartisan.
Well, I must say, first of all, that I'm here as a nonpartisan, that I'm an independent.
Understood.
I don't stand for either party in this. This depends. I've respected Mr. Stevenson in many of his utterances, respected Mr. Acheson in many of his utterances, although I've disagreed with him very much on other things. It's very difficult for a party out of power to prove what it can do.
But there is no Republican who comes readily to your mind in whom you have that confidence that that man has an understanding, the understanding that we need to lead us at this time.
I hate to engage in personalities. I think that Mr. Nixon in his public utterances recently has shown awareness of the situation, but
that interview is particularly interesting to me because Kissinger at the time was working for Rockefeller and did not bring up Rockefeller's name, but it got to a persona that Kissinger did present as a nonpartisan, as someone who looked at foreign policy without looking at these political issues. And this is something Kissinger certainly cultivated very much. But the C-SPAN interview in July of 1958 also highlights Kissinger as one of the top people in thinking about foreign policy in the United States. It's really quite an extraordinary thing to think that 60 years ago, Henry Kissinger was already being seen in this light. Kissinger was a part-time advisor. Kissinger did not enter government, though, directly or in a full-time way. He was a part-time advisor to Kennedy on German issues. McGeorge Bundy, who was Kennedy's national security advisor, tended to mistrust Kissinger because of his ties to Rockefeller, but did use him on some of the questions that JFK or Kennedy faced on Berlin. Under Lyndon Johnson, though, Kissinger was active in attempting to get secret negotiations going with the North Vietnamese, particularly the Pennsylvania Initiative. He developed ties to both Republicans and Democrats during this period. And it's perhaps characteristic of American foreign policy during the period of Cold War consensus that Kissinger could have as many relationships with Republicans as with Democrats. And it's a fascinating aspect that he more than likely would have received an appointment no matter who won in 1968. Now, there is controversy over Kissinger's role in the 1968 election. He worked for Rockefeller. He was deeply disappointed when Rockefeller was defeated, but he stayed involved with the Paris negotiations. And it's clear that he was warning Richard Nixon that a bombing halt was about to come, the famous October surprise. Many of you may know that there is controversy. This is one of the 68 elections, one of those elections in which you could make the case that the presidents were interfering in foreign policy at this time. Richard Nixon evidently sent messages to the South Vietnamese not to come to the negotiating table. And Lyndon Johnson on his tapes refers to this as treason. In his attack on Henry Kissinger that Christopher Hitchens wrote, Hitchens accuses Kissinger of having basically committed the same offense by warning Nixon of the possibility of a bombing halt. I think a lot of this is a bit overdone for Kissinger. Kissinger was playing both sides of the fence, but it also minimizes the degree to which both the South Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese knew what they were doing in terms of whether they were going to come to begin peace negotiations in 1968. But this was, of course, this was also a contact between Nixon and Kissinger, and led Nixon to decide to offer Kissinger a position in his administration after the election. I was going to show Kissinger's introduction on the television news. That did not work, but one of the things you would have seen there was that Kissinger was appointed National Security Advisor before Nixon even appointed a Secretary of State. And he was asked about that, and Nixon said, well, I'm going to appoint a strong Secretary of State, and basically made the case that Kissinger was instructed not to build a wall between himself and the Secretary of State, all of which, of course, was very misleading about what role Kissinger would play and how central Nixon would want foreign policy to be controlled by the White House. The particular clip I was going to show you from Walter Cronkite's news report also contained a somewhat ironic segment at the end, because right after Nixon introduces Kissinger to the press, he goes to meet the Heisman Trophy winners and meets with O.J. Simpson, of all people. The first couple of years of the Nixon presidency were very, very difficult. And I use a quotation, "You can't lose them all," because that's something that Henry Kissinger said to a reporter when they had a modest foreign policy success in the Middle East. Kissinger could be quite humorous and self-deprecating with reporters, which is one of the reasons he did enjoy, I think, a very favorable relationship with them. But the first 2 years of the Nixon presidency were difficult. Nixon thought he could solve Vietnam quickly. He was going to threaten North Vietnam. He was going to try to get Moscow to pressure North Vietnam. None of this worked. Ultimately, of course, the war expanded into Cambodia. There were enormous domestic protests, the moratoriums, the Kent State incident in Kent State, which brought Washington to a halt. There was relatively little progress on getting a summit with Russia. Nixon had also indicated from very early on he wanted an opening to China, but nothing seemed to come of that early in the administration. He did pronounce the so-called Nixon Doctrine, which talked about the United States now pulling away from intervening directly with its own military forces, and the idea being of a retrenchment of U.S. power. Nixon also failed to stop the election of an installation in government of Salvador Allende in Chile. They did have some success in the Middle East in preventing the overthrow of Jordan's King Hussein. But for the most part, the first 2 years of the Nixon administration were marked by frustration and failure. Henry Kissinger crafted an image, though, and here he is on the cover of Time magazine within a couple of months of the administration. And Kissinger crafted this image as the president's top advisor. It became pretty clear to foreign diplomats, to others, that Nixon was listening far more to Kissinger than to his Secretary of State, William Rogers. And Kissinger was getting quite favorable media attention. He also crafted an image in other ways, too. He had a sort of colorful private life, the secret swinger, where he would date Hollywood actresses and other figures. I have the picture of them here with Marlo Thomas, with Jill St. John, Barbara Walters, Elizabeth Taylor. Kissinger crafted this image. It was much more of an image than any reality. He was actually already dating and in a serious relationship with Nancy McGinnis, who would become his second wife. But this also appealed to Washington reporters, and he became a feature in the Washington Post style section as well as its news section. And in a way, he developed this the idea of the power behind the throne, and became very much a Washington celebrity during this time. And then that would be a breakout point later. The midterm elections were something of a shock to Nixon. The Republicans did gain a couple seats in the Senate, but they lost badly in the House, and the margin increased. Nixon admits in his memoirs that he thought he might have been a one-term president. He started thinking about ending the war in Vietnam with an announcement that that he was going to end it. He told his advisors to highlight Kissinger because the media was treating Kissinger so favorably. And in the news report, which I would have used and did use and discuss in my book, Kissinger decided to resign from Harvard. Harvard only allowed professors a 2-year period to leave. Kissinger resigned. And it's also, in this particular interview, Kissinger also comments on what had been a plot talked about among anti-war activists to kidnap him. This ended up becoming a trial. The informer particularly was compromised, and all the defendants were acquitted. The interesting thing is Kissinger actually met with some of the people who were accused of kidnapping him. Kissinger kept open ties to the anti-war movement and met with a number of figures from it during the time he was National Security Advisor. The low point in the Nixon presidency came, and you'd almost want to date it back now 50 years, during the Laos invasion. Nixon sent South Vietnamese forces into Laos, with, of course, the South Vietnamese government going along with it. It went very badly. The invasion rested on bad intelligence. The South Vietnamese forces ended up getting mauled by the North Vietnamese. Republican congressional leaders came to try to pressure Nixon to set a date to get out of Vietnam. Nixon resented their pressure. Kissinger actually went on TV during this period, and I had a link to that, where he defended the administration's policy and tried to make a case for it. This particular clip that I use is fascinating to me on another level, because Kissinger is asked, this is February of 1971, he's asked about the possibility that China might intervene against the United States and Southeast Asia. And Kissinger is well aware that the Nixon administration is trying to open channels to China. And watching him really nervously try to deal with a television reporter's question is fascinating to me, knowing what he knows. Now, Nixon gave a speech at the end of this, in which he defended the Laotian incursion and said that it would lead to greater withdrawals, and defended his policy. And at the end of his speech, Henry Kissinger called him up.
Mr. President?
Yeah, hi, Henry.
This was the best speech you've delivered since you've been in office. I don't know. I think November 3rd was better, but we will never have a moment. We'll never have a moment like that again.
Well, the November 3rd speech was not well delivered, Mr. President, if you remember.
Yeah.
It was a powerful speech.
Yeah.
This one was really movingly delivered. And I don't know whether you saw the commentary afterwards.
Of course, I don't look at the commentary.
Well,
I don't care what the bastards say.
Well, but this is so amazing, John. First of all, no one was fly-specking it. John Chancellor was very favorable. Everyone is saying a strong man sticking to his guns, carrying out his policy, not being driven off. Dan Rather, very positive. Marvin Kalf, very positive. The only guy who was fly-specking it a little bit is the Pentagon correspondent who had been...
How about Howard Smith? How'd he do? He would not.
I wanted to play that because, of course, it highlights one of the reasons why I think the TV archive was so helpful to me. They cared a lot about what the TV said. Despite what Nixon said about not caring what the bastard said, he cared a lot about how his policy was presented. And he asked Kissinger, and all the people he mentioned were all the television anchors that he was interested in hearing. How did they react to this? And in a way, using the tapes with the television archive, you can see in a way how important the television and the presentation of the foreign policy was. Effectively, what happens is almost immediately after Nixon pulls out of Laos, the Chinese indicate through both the ping-pong diplomacy and through secret messages to the Nixon administration that they're interested in some type of opening to the United States. And ping-pong diplomacy gets incredible television coverage.
Hello, Henry. I was wondering how they, if you checked in to see how they played the Chinese thing today?
Oh, yeah, it was tremendous. It was the lead item on every... I didn't see it myself. I was with Bob Griffin, but I talked to Haig.
Yeah.
But he says it's been a tremendous thing on television. It's been the lead item on every television thing. And so
Rather than Vietnam, for a change.
yeah, it's gone on and on and on.
I just want briefly, if we could, that it gives you an idea of how Nixon very quickly grasped how significant China could be for his foreign policy, and how much they were concerned about how things were presented, how their foreign policy was perceived and reacted to by the networks and the media. The opening, Nixon would send Henry Kissinger to China. This would begin the process of getting him enormous good press. In my book, I talk about how significant this was to the administration, the secret trip of Kissinger, and then the announcement that Nixon makes. It's one of the big reversals in his public opinion and in his standing in the election. And again, I'm stressing here that the domestic politics of China, obviously it had a geopolitical element too, but the domestic politics were highly significant, so much so that one of the instructions Nixon gave to Kissinger when he went to China is make sure the Democrats can't go before him. Tell the Chinese not to invite Democratic leaders. Make sure that his trip is the one that is highlighted. Nixon would, of course, also reveal in January of 1972, which was the key question, that he was conducting secret negotiations with the North Vietnamese through Henry Kissinger. And there's a funny story in William Safire's book where Kissinger comes to him and says, I'm on the cover of both national news weeklies this week. And Safire says, well, Henry, you may have peaked, or something along those lines. But he was seen as Nixon's secret agent. This again, adding to the prestige and significance of Henry Kissinger, was already dominating, that he was seen as Nixon's secret agent in carrying out the secret negotiations with the North Vietnamese that had been going on. If I had been able to show you this, you would have gotten a sense of this. I mean, it was highly, the interesting thing was, even at this point, the Nixon administration still restricted how Kissinger was covered. They didn't even allow, when he gave the briefing on his trips to Vietnam, for there to be any audio recordings. There was still this notion that his German accent would not play well in Peoria. They ultimately abandoned that belief, but they were still concerned about Henry Kissinger's appearance, even although he'd already begun to have a higher public profile. I stress in the book the trifecta of foreign policy successes in 1972, as connected, of course, to Nixon's landslide victory in the 72 election. The trip to China was heavily choreographed for television news. Kissinger plays a subsidiary role there, but the key there is to understand how significant the coverage was and the portrayal was there. Kissinger played a more important role in the trip to the Soviet Union and the signing of the SALT Agreement in May of 1972. This coming about despite the bombing of North Vietnam and the mining of Haiphong Harbor in response to the North Vietnamese offensive. And in the book, I make it clear that actually it was Nixon who really saw the politics of this, and that he recognized that he could not be defeated in Vietnam and still win re-election. And so he went ahead with the escalation, even when Kissinger advised him that it might lead to a cancellation of the summit. Nixon turned out to be gambling correctly. The Soviets did not cancel the summit. And they actually, the success gave Nixon another great Cold War foreign policy success. Finally, the trifecta, the third part of the trifecta, was the October Agreement on the Vietnam Peace Accords. And Kissinger, this would be the first public announcement. Kissinger would give a press conference on October 26, 1972, in which he would utter the words, "Peace is at hand." Even though the South Vietnamese government had raised all sorts of objections. This was about a week and a half before the election. The coverage of Kissinger's press conference was quite comprehensive.
Hello,
Mr. President.
Well, Henry, I understand that all the three news shows were about Vietnam, and I wonder why.
Colson called me, and he thinks that we've wiped McGovern out now.
Did he really?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was thought you'd be interested. I was in West Virginia and Kentucky, and I played it even a little more low key than we talked. You know, I said that based on the progress that has been made to date, I can say with confidence tonight that I believe we will achieve our goals. You know, just like that.
What was the response?
The they practically take the roof off.
And Nixon and Kissinger, Time magazine made them Men of the Year. This irritated the heck out of Nixon, who really didn't like the fact he was always having to share public acclaim with Kissinger, but he couldn't escape it. The Vietnam Peace Agreement, of course, had a significant bump in the road in that the talks collapsed after the election, and Nixon undertook the Christmas bombing of North Vietnam, and this did ultimately bring a peace agreement. In January of '73, they would finally make the accord. The Paris Peace Treaty, of course, has been seen by some as a very, very flawed agreement. It allowed North Vietnamese troops to stay in the South. There is the question of whether the Nixon-Kissinger team essentially negotiated this agreement to basically get a decent interval between American withdrawal and the collapse of South Vietnam. About 10 years ago, I got the chance to actually ask Henry Kissinger this question.
Dr. Kissinger, I'd like to ask you about what's known in the historians' field as the decent interval strategy, namely the argument that the administration's policy was premised on the idea that a withdrawal of the United States should be accomplished and that there should be a decent interval between then and the prospect of a communist takeover in the South. And I know you know some of the materials on this. I wondered if you give your perspective as to whether you thought South Vietnam could sustain an existence as a viable state.
Well, first of all, as historians, what you should do when you see statements is to ask yourself about the context in which they were made. And you will find that all the statements that are sort of twisted into decent interval statements were made to the other side, almost all of them. And what they were attempting to say was, we are willing to have a political contest, and we are willing to abide by the outcome of this political contest. But that didn't mean that we were resigned to the outcome of that political contest.
His answer goes on a bit, and he does give a decent defense of it, but in the end, he also acknowledges that the United States knew it could not stay in Vietnam for forever, and that the only thing I want to comment on is his initial argument that the decent interval, these statements about decent interval only made to foreign leaders, is not correct. In fact, Kissinger and Nixon talked about this oftentimes between each other, and I have some references to that in the book. They recognized they needed an interval of some sort. So it's an interesting aspect of the settlement in Vietnam. Nixon or Kissinger thought that that there would be this foreign policy renaissance with the end of the Vietnam War, that they could contain or continue with foreign policy between the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, this sort of great powers policy. Well, Nixon collapses. Watergate emerges as a central issue in March of 1973. Nixon's popularity and political capital begins to collapse. But the ironic thing is, this does not happen to Kissinger. Kissinger actually becomes stronger during this period. Kissinger and Nixon actually sees in what Kissinger is doing in diplomacy as something that'll might help him survive. And so he actually encourages this belief about Kissinger and encourages Kissinger's involvement in a number of foreign policy issues. Kissinger continues to get really glowing media coverage. When he becomes then Secretary of State, Nixon did not necessarily want to appoint Kissinger to Secretary of State. In fact, he didn't want to, but he was really compelled to by Kissinger's increasing popularity and status that he could not really afford. Losing Kissinger would completely damage his administration. So he appoints him as Secretary of State. Kissinger, of course, plays a very hugely significant role in the Middle East, and I would argue that this is one of the most important aspects of Kissinger's long-term contribution was his involvement. He negotiates disengagement agreements between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Syria. The clip I had here, which I can't really use or can't show you, but begins with John Chancellor on NBC News saying Henry Kissinger did it. This idea that Kissinger had forged this peace in the Middle East. And it it leads to this type of treatment of Kissinger, having him as Superman on Newsweek and Mideast Miracle on Time magazine. This was this idea Kissinger really was running American foreign policy. Nixon resigns, Ford comes into power. Kissinger now becomes the focus of a great deal more attack. The Watergate class of 1974, the Democratic opposition becomes attacking Kissinger, particularly for the morality of his policies toward dictatorships, the opposition to détente among conservatives, and then, of course, the collapse in South Vietnam in April of 1975. This gives you an image of a different sort. Kissinger trying to get Sadat and the Israeli leader Rabin together. The world of woes, Kissinger under attack from all sorts of foreign policy crises. Effectively, Kissinger actually, although he becomes an issue in the 1976 election, and I do want to, I'll rush through this a bit, but although he becomes an issue in the 76 election, his foreign policy actually ends more popular. One of the most popular aspects of the foreign policy. Ford, though, is not able to explain it. And in committing the gaffe in the second presidential debate, where he talks about how Poland is not dominated by the Soviet Union, this ends up cratering a possibility of Ford actually winning, as he had regained momentum after the first debate. Kissinger was seen as too powerful in that sense and too dominant of Jerry Ford, and this would ultimately hurt Ford. Jimmy Carter is elected, but Kissinger remains almost a shadow Secretary of State. He's a figure of great prominence during the Carter administration. I record and deal with this all in one chapter, talking about his involvement, for example, getting the Shah into the United States, some of the unpopularity connected to that, some of the first attacks on Kissinger appearing in the Shawcross book, Sideshow, and Joseph Heller's book on Kissinger. Kissinger does not come into a regular position with Ronald Reagan. Reagan's right-wing supporters are deeply antagonistic to Kissinger, and Reagan does not appoint him, but he does serve. He is an advisor. His proteges have an influence into the first Bush administration, and he becomes an occasional advisor to Clinton, to George W. Bush, and even talking to Obama about China. He resigns from the 9/11 Commission. He becomes an author of numerous books, more recently on China and world order. He does try to soften his image by appearing in a number of ads.
I'd like to begin by introducing Dr. Henry Kissinger. Let's roll the video.
Your champagne, Mr. Burnside.
Thank you. You're sitting in seat 2A. I wonder who will be sitting next to you in seat 2B.
Your seat, sir.
Hey.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening. It's Henry Kissinger. Ready for a good chat?
Let me just say, in the book, I get into this much more depth, but I think what I think I've been able to do in the book is demonstrate the tensions between domestic policy and politics and making of foreign policy through the prism of Henry Kissinger in that sense. And I do see Kissinger as more of a tactician than a strategist that he promotes himself as. But I also see Kissinger, by the end of the time he's in government, recognizing some of the limits of American power, even as he tries to exercise it and use it around the world, that he's aware of the difficulties of conducting foreign policy when it becomes and is so much a factor in domestic political competition and domestic political rivalries and policies. Kissinger tended to personalize foreign policy a great deal, seeing his own personal role as quite crucial, even though at the time he would often frequently dismiss the influence of personalities on foreign policy. I think my book also gets at something of the role of the media as an important aspect in foreign policy making, particularly in the politics of foreign policy. Kissinger ultimately is an unapologetic Cold Warrior, and I think in a way the Ferguson book is going to present him in that light as having been central to the successes in the Cold War. I see him as having both been successful and also having some important failures along the way. But I think the most important lesson I did want to convey in my book was this degree to which American foreign policy is very much connected to our domestic politics and our domestic political thinking, and that in a sense it becomes a reflection of those politics, which is kind of a disturbing thought these days in some ways because our domestic politics are so polarized, but I think does get at, I think, an important element in understanding the history of U.S. foreign relations.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.